During World War II, there were many guards and senior commanders of the concentration camps who were responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. Inside some of the deadliest camps, the SS men and women who worked in sites such as Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz were deliberately instructed to instigate reigns of terror and violence over the inmates. Execution squads operated within the camps, and at Auschwitz one of the most ruthless sites of execution was at the Death Wall. The concrete wall that stood between the torture block and the Human Medical Experimentation Centre was where thousands of people were shot up against. The men who took the lives of many prisoners of war and inmates here were commanded in their actions by Hans Aumeier, an SS commander who became one of the most virulent Nazis who worked inside of Auschwitz. Aumeier was also the commandant of another camp, but he was sent to Auschwitz as the SS hierarchy believed that he was someone who could put thousands of people to death. At the end of the war, he was a wanted man, but was arrested and turned over based on information obtained by the British Secret Services. He was then brought to trial alongside many other former guards of Auschwitz, and he was ultimately sentenced to death. Aumeier went to his death believing he was a scapegoat for the Nazis and for the loss of the Second World War, but in reality he was a ruthless killer and executioner who was responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. But what specifically did he do that led to his execution? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Hans Aumeier was born on the 20th of August 1906, and he grew up inside a relatively small town known as Amberg. He attended his local schools, and there was nothing in his early life that showed that one day he would become a monster and someone who would willingly execute many people. After leaving school with no qualifications at all, Aumeier worked inside of a local rifle factory, and he took an apprenticeship there and followed in his father's footsteps, working at the same place as him. He was too young to serve in the First World War, but he then in 1923 left his job as he had got a better job in the city of Munich. Munich, of course, was seen by many as the birthplace of National Socialism and Nazism, and in the years before Adolf Hitler had tried to launch his putsch, his failed attempt to cause a revolution and seize control inside of Germany. Aumeier tried to join the Reichswehr, the army, but he was not allowed to join, and he returned to work inside of the factories, doing the same sort of work, but this time inside different German cities. But like many people in the 1920s in Germany, Hans Aumeier lost his job due to the economic crisis, and he took whatever work he could to survive. In December 1929, he was alerted to a fledgling political party, the Nazi Party, and he joined, and was considered one of the earlier members, but he then 2 years later had a more active role as a member of Hitler's brown shirts, the SA, or Sturmabteilung. Inside of the Nazi Party, Aumeier found regular work, and he served as a driver at the SA headquarters in Berlin, and he regularly ferried senior members of the group, such as Ernst Röhm, the SA leader, around to different meetings. He then within months transferred to join the SS, Heinrich Himmler's paramilitary group, who would begin as Hitler's personal bodyguard unit, but they would become the guards of the concentration camps, and would during World War II have the blood of millions of people on their hands. Aumeier worked in the SS garage, fixing the cars and maintaining the vehicles of the SS leaders, and he was a driver for Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. He completed this work for many years, but he then became involved in the concentration camps, following the Nazi seizure of power. At some point he was sent to Dachau concentration camp, the first that opened, to learn how to become a guard of the camps. Dachau was known for its torture and brutality, and the violence of the guards shown towards inmates here, especially those who were political prisoners and in the early stages of the camp, was horrific. Aumeier worked inside many other camps such as Esterwegen and Lichtenburg, and he was seen as a reliable SS official. He was well known personally to Heinrich Himmler, and through his links he rose throughout the different SS promotions. On the 1st of February 1942, Hans Aumeier was sent to Auschwitz concentration camp. Auschwitz had opened in May 1940, with Commandant Rudolf Höss dreaming of creating the largest and deadliest most efficient concentration camp of the Third Reich. He transformed a former army barracks to become the largest site of slaughter of World War II, and over 1.1 million people would be killed at Auschwitz. There were huge amounts of guards who were sent to go and work at the camp to oversee those who were deported from all over German-occupied territories. At the end of the war, only 789 SS members, roughly 15% of those guards who worked at the site, were ever brought to trial. Freight trains delivered prisoners from all over Europe, and many were slaughtered inside the gas chambers as soon as they arrived at the camp. Hans Aumeier was sent to Auschwitz with a specific job in mind. He was made the head of Department 3, and was also named the Schutzhaftlagerführer inside of Auschwitz I. This job saw him responsible for the economic output of Auschwitz I, the main camp, and the orders that Aumeier gave out involved ordering brutal treatment of prisoners, and they were responsible for maintaining order, overseeing roll calls and other daily duties. It was a senior position for Aumeier, and he stayed in the job until August 1943. But whilst at Auschwitz, he gained a notorious reputation for himself because of his behaviour towards prisoners. He was known for being a brutal man who ordered the torture and beating of many inmates and prisoners, and he also carried out many executions, ordering firing squads to shoot inmates. On the 19th of March 1942, roughly 6 weeks after he arrived at Auschwitz, he made a name for himself, having 144 women and female prisoners being dragged to the execution wall, known as the Death Wall, that was found between Block 10 and Block 11. Aumeier ordered the firing squad to get ready, and one by one the 144 women were all shot and were executed, with Aumeier standing there to witness the proceedings. In May 1942 he did exactly the same, and he ordered this time 168 prisoners to be taken to Auschwitz's Death Wall, where they were all shot in the same way. The bodies were then taken to the crematoria nearby, where they were then reduced to ashes. He was a ruthless man who would not stop at anything to bring misery to the lives of inmates. But he did attract some suspicion within the SS. On the 18th of August 1943, Aumeier was summoned to the SS headquarters as he was accused and then found guilty of corruption. Specifically, he had been linked to the theft of gold and other valuables taken from the victims of the gas chambers. When prisoners of Auschwitz were sent to the chambers, they were ordered to undress as soon as they arrived at the camp, and their valuables which they had brought with them were also confiscated. This property, it was said, was technically property of the Third Reich and of the Nazi Party, meaning that Aumeier's stealing was taken from the pockets of Adolf Hitler. This was a crime that some commandants such as Karl Otto Koch actually paid for with their lives. Aumeier, after being found guilty, was sacked upon the orders of Commandant of Auschwitz, Rudolf Höss. With this he was then sent to the SS Higher and Police Chief Leader, Friedrich Jeckeln, and he was involved with the SS Construction Brigade of the 5th SS Panzer Corps, and this new unit was responsible for building fortifications in the region near to Leningrad. It was punishment being sent to the Eastern Front for his crimes, but Aumeier had his 7,000 slave labourers construct a new concentration camp in Estonia, known as Vaivara. Aumeier then became the commandant of the camp, and during its time in operation, over 20,000 prisoners passed through the camp. The purpose of Vaivara was to exploit workers and to exterminate them through labour, and prisoners had to work in the nearby forests, quarries, or in the extraction of oil. The prisoners who were too sick to work or were too old were shot and executed in selections, overseen by Aumeier. Even children who arrived at Vaivara were taken into the woods, where they were then shot. Disease broke out at the camp, and 20% of the population were killed by the December 1943 typhus epidemic. Eventually Vaivara was evacuated due to the advances of the Soviet Red Army, and Aumeier reported back to Jeckeln, and he was part of a police battalion. He did fight on the front lines briefly, but then in 1944 he was asked to report to SS Gruppenführer Richard Glücks, based at Oranienburg. He asked if he could return back to Dachau concentration camp so he could see his family in the nearby region, and this was allowed, but he was taken ill with an eye injury, and he spent some time in hospital. Aumeier then was asked upon his release to go to Norway to become the commandant of a new concentration camp, and Aumeier yet again asked to see his family, but this was rejected. He was told to meet with Max Pauli, another commandant, for further instructions, and he then, in Oslo, had to oversee the building of a camp to house 3,000 slave labourers. Aumeier did manage to build this site, but it's alleged that the prisoners of the camp were kept in relatively good conditions, and he even invited the Norwegian Red Cross into the camp. On the 7th of May 1945, with the Second World War very much over in Europe, Aumeier opened the camp and he allowed the prisoners to all go free without any execution or extermination. He may have done this as he knew that war crimes trials would take place shortly, and that as a former guard and a senior one who worked at Auschwitz, then he would likely be condemned to death for his crimes. He was possibly trying to portray himself as a good Nazi, but this was of course not the case. Hans Aumeier was arrested and was sent to the Terne camp, and he remained here for some time. But in the meantime, British MI6 had been searching through Gestapo files and papers, and Hans Aumeier's name cropped up in evidence as being a senior SS commander who worked at Auschwitz, and who had been responsible for the executions of many prisoners. Inside of the camp, Aumeier was not hiding his SS rank. He was still in uniform, unlike many who had ditched this to try and escape war crimes proceedings. He admitted his rank and name, and he was then passed over to American intelligence officers for interrogation. Like many former guards of Auschwitz, Hans Aumeier was extradited to Poland to stand in front of a courtroom in the country of his crimes. He was brought to the Auschwitz trial, alongside 39 other senior members of staff of Auschwitz, before the Supreme National Tribunal in Krakow. The proceedings began on the 24th of November 1947, and Aumeier was said to have been the second most senior defendant, and he was the defendant number 2 behind Arthur Lieber-Henschel, the former commandant of Auschwitz. It was claimed during the verdict of the Auschwitz trial that torturing of prisoners of Auschwitz, already tormented to the extreme by extrajudicial means, is the evidence of inhuman savagery perpetrated by those defendants who, as a result of the trial, were sentenced to death. The listed violent crimes committed by named defendants, who all took smaller or larger part in the mass murder of prisoners, also reveal that the accused were involved in the acts of killing for pleasure, and not pursuant to orders of their superiors. If it were not for their express desire to kill, they would have otherwise displayed elements of sympathy for the victims, or at least shown indifference to their plight, but not torture them to death. Hans Aumeier was brought to answer much evidence, and the courtroom hosted many former prisoners of Auschwitz who testified about his brutal actions and reputation, and the evidence about executions he had ordered and overseen on the Auschwitz death wall terrified the people inside the courtroom. He was, at the end of the trial, on the 22nd of December 1947, sentenced to death for his crimes, and in his final statements to the court, Hans Aumeier claimed that he would die as a scapegoat for Germany, and he had little to no remorse for his crimes, and he believed that he was not guilty of any crime, showing what a ruthless official he truly was. He had even previously informed the courtroom that he had never personally killed anyone at Auschwitz, and seen no one killed, and he said his men and soldiers under his command had not killed either, and he also claimed that he knew nothing about the gas chambers. He was quite clearly a blatant and unrepentant Nazi. For just over a month, Hans Aumeier sat on death row inside of Krakow's Montelupich prison, knowing that his date with the executioner would soon come. The executions of the Auschwitz trial did not utilise gallows. Instead, in the ceiling of the execution chamber of the prison, there were many different hooks on the ceiling used to hang prisoners and bring their lives to an end. On the 28th of January 1948, Hans Aumeier was brought from his prison cell into the execution chamber, along with a number of other condemned guards who had worked at Auschwitz and who had been sentenced to death in the trial. He was helped up onto a box which was stood underneath one of the hooks, and he was ordered to stand upon it. An executioner then quickly passed the noose over the hook, and then secured the noose around Hans Aumeier's neck. He tightened it, and then swiftly kicked out the box from underneath Hans Aumeier, and he slowly strangled to death. He kicked about and struggled for some time, but within a few minutes his struggles had ended, and his body twitched a few times before it then came to rest. Hans Aumeier was a senior guard of the concentration camps, who oversaw the execution and deaths of hundreds of people. He was someone who had little care for the people who had suffered under his leadership, and he had a death toll of thousands on his hands. He was forced to leave Auschwitz after being caught stealing gold for his own wealth, but he later returned as a commandant of some smaller sites and camps, but all of these were truly deadly. But his real work inside of Auschwitz was discovered, and for this he paid the ultimate price, being executed inside a dark and cold execution chamber within a Polish prison. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.